Yep, sounds good.
Well, everyone, welcome back to a very exciting episode of the Storybox podcast. Today, my friends, I'm delighted to welcome an unlikely prisoner. That is the title of my guest's new book today. His name is Sean Turnell. Now, for those of you that may not recognize who this incredible man is, I'm very excited to actually unbox his story, as you guys are no doubt going to learn more about his incredible journey that he's been on, being stuck 650 days in Myanmar's most notorious prisons. Sean, I normally at this time, I normally switch the introduction over to my guests and I ask them, instead of me gushing about who you are and what you do, I thought it would be best coming from your mouth about who you are, what you do, and why do you do it. So, Sean, please take it away.
Well, thanks very much, Jay. It's a real pleasure to appear on this podcast. So my name's Sean Turnell. I was a professor of economics at Macquarie University in Sydney and very much a sort of mild-mannered academic for a lot of my life. I grew up in the western suburbs of Sydney, but spent 30 years at Macquarie Uni and the Reserve Bank before that. But yeah, basically an economist, academic, the sort of person who never got into trouble about anything. I quite literally have never even received a traffic violation. But it ended up in February 2021 that I was arrested by Burma's military junta, which had just taken power in a coup a few days earlier. I ended up being arrested by that junta, spending 650 days in some of the most notorious prisons in Southeast Asia, in Myanmar, and got back in November 2022. Have written a book about it all called An Unlikely Prisoner, which I think captures the whole thing again of, uh, someone who, the least likely person who would end up in an Asian prison. And that's what the book story is. And I guess that's, why people may or may not know my name these days.
Well, Sean, it's a pleasure and an honor to have you on the show. So thank you so much for your time. And for those people that are watching the video, I'm holding up Sean's book here, An Unlikely Prisoner. It's available November 14th, but this episode will go live before it comes out. So that will give people a chance to actually pre-order the book. We all know pre-orders are very, very important. Sean, you spent 650 days in some of Myanmar's most notorious prisons. They thought you were a spy. How in the world could they think you, of all people, are a spy?
Well, again, that's also extremely unlikely. And on one account, I actually said to one of the prison guards, I said, "Look, I'm not Jason Bourne." But I didn't seem to cut any ice. So the basis of it was, so I was over there in Myanmar as an economic advisor to Aung San Suu Kyi, who was the leader of Myanmar's civilian government, and I'd known her for about 20 years. So my academic work had increasingly concentrated on Burma. So Burma or Myanmar, by the way, it goes by both of those names. So I was quite well known to the civilian government that had taken power under her leadership in 2016. And I've been invited over there, as I say, to being their advisor. But what that meant, of course, by being her advisor, meant that I saw all sorts of government documents. And in fact, I worked with the government and I worked as something of a liaison as well between that civilian government and governments like Australia's and America's and with the World Bank and the IMF and all that. So obviously I got, a lot of data, a lot of documents I used to help them with and all of that. But then when the coup took place, the military, who hated Aung San Suu Kyi and that civilian government, they were looking for excuses. And when I was there and stuck there, which I'm sure we'll get to, they thought, well, hang on, he's got all these documents. He must be a spy. Even though, as I say, it was really just part of my job being over there to help that civilian government bring about economic reform. So yeah, so it was basically my possession of documents, correspondence between myself and Suu Kyi, government ministers, and so on. They used that as a way of trying to paint a story that I was this sort of master spy in the background, pulling all the strings. And that that's the case they tried to make.
I've got a couple of questions coming from that. First being, is Australia friendly with Myanmar?
Well, we were, and again, my job, because I should add that I was there on behalf of the Australian government. It was part of an aid program of Australia to Myanmar. So, yeah, very much a friend. Australia was really supportive of Myanmar's civilian government because Myanmar is one of those countries, unfortunately, that's been ruled by the military for most of its modern history. But in 2015, Aung San Suu Kyi and the National League for Democracy came into government, and this was a time of incredible hope. So Australia was unbelievably supportive. We provided lots of aid, again, as I say, Australia supported me to go over there, help the Myanmar government get through. So we were very friendly. But when the military took over, they knew Australia wouldn't be happy, America wouldn't be happy, the UK, just about everywhere, basically, except for Russia, uh, wasn't happy. So yeah, so now the relationship, of course, between Australia and the military junta that currently rules the place is very, very strained, as it is again with just about every country and this junta, with the possible exception, as I mentioned, of Russia.
And had you been over there several times previously, or was this your first time going over there?
No, I'd been over many times. So I'd first got to know Aung San Suu Kyi about 20 years ago, and went to see her soon after she was released from house arrest in the late 2000s, so about 2010. Then I was there over there all the time, and then permanently over there from 2016 when I had this advisory role. So the country was very, very familiar to me. I felt extremely comfortable there, knew lots of people, felt safe there, and so on. And then the coup arrived, of course, which proved that the place wasn't as safe as I thought.
For those people that may not be familiar with Myanmar's political structure and system, what does it look like, and what does their economic situation look like as well? Why do they need your support?
Well, so Myanmar is one of the poorest countries in the world, and by a big margin, the poorest country in mainland Southeast Asia. So
Wow.
we're all used to the story these days, the Asian tigers and the incredible growth, and even the incredible trajectory of countries like Vietnam and so on these days, and of course China and so on as well. And Myanmar is the country that missed out. So
Oh.
it's incredibly poor, mainly because of really bad economic policies and governance from the military regimes that have ruled them for such a long time. Yeah, so very, very poor place, with a lot to catch up on, which means, though, that there's incredible potential because, just with the most simple policies, good policies put in place, the country could really catch up. So I was there to help them do that, and we were making incredible progress from 2016, which again just makes the coup so unfortunate because, we're really beginning to turn the corner.
Is there a lot of coups that happen in Myanmar, or was that one expected to actually take place?
Bit of both, in the sense that there has been a lot of coups. And this one, even though it took me by surprise, the actual coup itself, in a sense, the idea that there would be a coup in Myanmar, in some ways, it is not a surprise, even though, as I say, this specific timing did take me by surprise. So the first of them took place way back in about 1960, and then there were multiple ones since. And the military has sort of ruled off and on all the way through since the very early 1960s.
And when we say military coup, for those people like that may have this uh, image in their brain from the movies, is it anything like that? Like the military comes in, starts shooting up people, or is it somewhat tame?
Well, no, it pretty much is like that, actually. In this particular occasion, the military at first, the first few days, it was sort of fairly peaceful, and the population came out dramatically and in large numbers to protest. And then just a couple of weeks in, the military started shooting.
Wow.
But yeah, they actually hesitated a bit at first, and there was a lot of hope actually that the coup might have been reversed after those first few days. But then the military resorted back to old form, and just started shooting people. So yeah, so a bit expected, and the brutality, to be honest, is what people have come to expect from Myanmar's military as well.
Far out. So the level of corruption in Myanmar is quite severe, I guess you could say.
Absolutely, mate. Exceedingly high. And it's one of the secrets, in a sense, behind my arrest, too, because as one of the economic reformers, one of the big things we were trying to do was push against corruption. We understood fully that you couldn't eliminate it, and etc. It was too ingrained for that. But some of the economic reforms, opening the economy up, making things more competitive, was starting to rub up against old monopolistic interests and so on. So, so it's interesting, Jay, that you mentioned corruption, because that was a very key component in why they came after someone like me.
It's an interesting thing seeing another country like Myanmar, who's the poorest in the Asian sector, right? Seeing them being the most corrupt almost. It's like, why is that the case? Is it because they've got nothing to lose almost, do you reckon?
Pretty much, right? And the military, I think, just have this presumption that they should have control and that they should be able to commandeer most of the resources. So, we would often try to enter into debate with them about what good economics meant. But for them, economics was just about how much can we get. It really didn't get any further than that.
Is economics supposed to be simple or hard?
It, I think it's fairly simple. I think economists might try to make it complex so that everyone will hire us and all that sort of thing. But it is pretty simple. You get some really basic things right with respect to policies and things like that. And really, it's about opening things up to as much competition as possible, securing property rights, which means that if people work hard and innovate, and come up with ideas and new products and all that, that they get to have the fruits of their labour and their ideas and all that. And then governments sort of step back a little bit. But in countries like Myanmar, where the military is in control, the military want a piece of the pie across the board. And I guess in terms of economic reform, what we were trying to do is take away some of that pie. We were trying to say, well, look, hang on, maybe you shouldn't get so much, and that of course upset them quite a bit.
I know Professor Ian Harper, who's also an economist from Melbourne,
Yeah.
and I believe he sat on the board, the RBA director board, I think it is, the one that makes
Yep.
decisions for our country and Reserve Bank and things of that nature. You did some work for the Reserve Bank, is that correct?
I did, mate. My career began at the Reserve Bank back in the early '80s, which again dates me terribly. And I worked there at a time, it's hard to believe now, when there weren't even any computers. There was a typing pool and things like that, which just seems very bizarre. But yeah, so for the first 8 years of my career, I was an economist at the Reserve Bank, but before deciding to become an academic.
So that you've got a lot of knowledge, a lot of insight into, say, the past versus the present. And I'm curious, like having seen probably the worst economy of the worst with the Myanmar's economy, how does it stack up against Australia's economy at the moment with everything that's inflation and raising house prices? I would be remiss if I didn't ask you, as an economist, of course.
Yeah, well, it doesn't compare at all, Jay. Australia is, in many ways, for all of our problems, and the problems you mentioned are certainly there. We're actually one of the best economies in the world. It's astonishing. And even whoever's in government, in the global scheme of things, they're all pretty good and pretty mild, and all the rest of it. So, I used to hold Australia up as an example all the time, particularly to a country like Myanmar, because Myanmar actually, funny enough, should be a rich country because it's got lots of natural resources, and it should be able to use that bounty to create a really good economy. But it doesn't, because of all the things we mentioned: corruption, military rule, etc. But Australia is probably the best example in the world of a country with abundant natural resources, but who's used those natural resources in ways to create a fantastic economy. Because of course, I'm sure everyone listening and watching this will be aware of an expression called the resources curse. And it's just that expression for countries that have a lot of natural resources can often, in a funny way, make the economy worse, because wealth is easily extracted, easily stolen, and it can actually sponsor bad government because, in a sense, governments don't need to do very much. All they need to be there is just be there and steal, basically. But Australia is an extraordinary example of a country that doesn't allow that to happen, where we've actually used our natural resource bounty to earn revenues, but we've turned those revenues into nation building, institution building, good education, good healthcare, all the things that you need for a good economy. So Australia does pretty well. And, even our inflation problem at the moment, that's a problem of, in a sense, things are, just going pretty well because it means there's lots of demand. And with lots of supply constraints, demand greater than supply pushes prices up. But yeah, in so many ways, Australia's problems, again, compared to just about any other country in the world, our problems are pretty good and pretty manageable. And yeah, to a country like Myanmar, not even close. But we do, I think, offer just a wonderful example. And I used to use Australia all the time and say, look, this is what's possible.
I often say that we are incredibly blessed to be in Australia of all countries because it could be so much worse. I know the rate of inflation. I myself, I'm 27 years old, looking to get into the housing market. It's incredibly tough and difficult at the moment to even do that.
Yeah,
And I'm seeing everything else, just, cost of living, all these things on the rise. I used to be in real estate, so I keep an eye on the property market all the time, seeing what it's doing. And it's just looking like things are getting further and further away. But yes, like you said, compared to countries like Myanmar, we've got nothing really to complain too much about. But having said that, as an economist and looking at Australia's natural resources, what we've got at our beck and call to actually use to fix inflation, how would you go about making the future, I guess, better for someone like myself, the younger generation, like to make it a little bit easier for us and the ones that are working nonstop?
yeah. I mean, it is a good point, mate. So having said that Australia, again, by world standards, is incredibly successful and all that, doesn't mean we don't have problems. And in particular, allowing people full access to this prosperous economy is an issue, and by full access, what we mean is particularly the property market. So we've got to be very careful that this bounty doesn't end up being skewed, to the baby boomer generation, etc., who are already in the real estate story. So yeah, so there does need to be some changes there. Part of it is on the supply side, just making sure that there's sufficient land and sufficient access to that land. I mean, sometimes you want parts of cities, etc., not to be zoned for house building and so on, but you also want to have a look at various restrictions in inner suburbs, particularly. We always have to be mindful of the whole NIMBY, not in my backyard scenario, and making sure that existing holders of real estate don't exclude others. So we do need to look at things like zoning, in particular in cities like Sydney and so on. Issues like transportation, making sure that as the suburbs move further and further out from the centre, that again people have access to the city and where they need to work and all that. So there's a whole bunch of issues, and then issues to do with finance, making sure that the banking system is fully competitive and all that, and that the banks are not just creaming off the top, and so yeah, all sorts of issues to do with affordability and making sure that people have access to that bounty that I mentioned. And it is important because if people feel they're denied the prosperity of a country like Australia, then that can undermine that prosperity because people feel that they don't have a stake in the system and will agitate for change. So even in a country like Australia, we've got to be forever vigilant to make sure that there's economic justice as well as economic growth.
Were you scared at all when the coup took place?
I was very worried. In retrospect, I wasn't worried enough because at first I thought, it gave me a big fright. So, the military intelligence suddenly arrived at my hotel and arrested me and so on. And, I was worried. It was all pretty scary and all that. But I thought I would probably be released quite quickly. I thought that they just wanted to put a scare in me. And then that they would release me. And if I'd known that they were going to keep me for nearly 2 years, I would have been much more terrified. But yeah, certainly wasn't pleasant, mate. And many of the experiences subsequently, and quite quickly actually after arrest, but then afterwards, were pretty terrifying. So yeah, wasn't a good experience, but I sort of consoled myself all the time with thinking that I was going to be released. But yeah, as I say, that didn't turn out to be true for an awful long time.
And this took place right as the rest of the world was being locked down in COVID.
That's right, and COVID was, of course, a very strong factor in all of this because when the coup took place, it took place on the 1st of February 2021. I was arrested on the 6th of February 2021. But in that 5 day gap, I was trying to get out of the country. I knew that the military would probably try and come after me and use me as an excuse to go after some of the others within the government as well. So I was trying to get out, but people will remember, I think, back at those really, deep COVID times, there were no flights. The only flights that were there were sort of emergency repatriation flights. And so I was desperately trying to get a seat on a plane and couldn't get it. So, so COVID was very much part of the story.
How did that make you feel when you couldn't get a flight?
Yeah, pretty worried. But again, I wasn't too worried because I thought, well, okay, look, even if the military is to come after me, it doesn't make any sense for them to keep me. It's just going to cause them international trouble. But I misjudged that. I do remember actually. In fact, it's a great question you've asked, Jay, because it's only just occurred to me that I actually, I did get a flight to London. I was going to be taken from Yangon, the big port city in Myanmar, all the way to London. I remember the worst I was thinking was that I'd have to quarantine in London for a couple of weeks. But as it turned out, the military got me before I could get on that flight. But I'd quite forgotten that I actually did get onto a flight, but it was going to leave, I think, later the very day that they arrested me.
So, of all the people on the flight, were there other Australians on that flight too?
I think there would have been. So I never got to the flight, of course, but there would have been. In fact, and when I was being arrested, I was held in the lobby of the hotel in Yangon for a long time because the Australian ambassador had arrived to sort of help me, and it meant that it sort of stopped the police from dragging me off to the jail straight away. But as I'm waiting in the lobby, as other foreigners saw what was happening to me, and I was quite a well-known figure there, all these other people got out. And as I'm waiting there in the lobby with the police who were arresting me, all these other foreigners came trooping through, including some Australians, and most of them would have been on their way to the airport. And I think actually my arrest sent a bit of a fright through the international community in Myanmar. And there's a lot of people who, were probably going to hang around and just see where things went. But after they arrested me, I think a lot of people thought, okay, we've got to get out.
And we've got an Australian embassy there, right?
That's right, eh? Yeah, and the ambassador. So the first thing I did when I was being arrested was get in touch with the Australian embassy, and the ambassador came over, and that slowed the process, which was good. And so they couldn't drag me off straight away. So we spent about 3 hours just hanging around the lobby of the hotel before I was taken away. But and it sort of put the Myanmar's military on notice that my arrest at least was not going unnoticed. In the end, I'm not sure that it stopped them very much because, again, they kept me for nearly 2 years and a lot of ill treatment followed and all that. But it did, yeah, at least it told them that yeah, as I say, that told them that someone was going to be watching.
What was going through your mind during that moment for you?
A lot of things. I was worried for myself, of course, but I was worried about my wife back home and my dad and my sister, my family, my daughter, all, a whole bunch of people. I was worried that they would be worried because in some ways it's almost better to be the person in a situation like that because as horrible as things are, you know what's happening to you, whereas people back home, they don't know that and their anxiety levels become really high. So I remember worrying a lot about the other people who would be worrying about me.
Yeah. And you couldn't get in touch with them?
I could for a bit, but then the regime took my phone, confiscated the phone. There was a funny moment where when I was very first arrested, I was actually on the phone to the BBC. The BBC World Service had rung me to find out what was happening just by coincidence, and I'd done some work for the BBC before, so that they knew me and all that. And I was talking to the BBC live on air at the moment I was being arrested, and I had to say to to the BBC broadcast. They said, "Look, I'm sorry, I have to hang up. I'm being arrested," which was caused a bit of a sensation at the time.
I can imagine. Like the journalist probably, or the the news anchor probably would have been like, "What?
That's right.
What's going on? What do we do now?"
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Poor Sean. My goodness. So what happened after that? So you're in the hotel lobby. Did they take you to prison straight after that, or were you processed and
Yeah, so I was taken off to a place that in the book and elsewhere I just called the box, which was a tiny interrogation room in a police station directly outside the walls of the big prison in Yangon, which goes by the wonderful name of Insane Prison, spelled Insein, but nonetheless pronounced insane, and that describes it pretty much. But yeah, police station just outside the walls of that. I was put into a room. It was about the size of a shipping container, one of those 20-foot equivalent units, I think they call them. And it had only a tiny slit window that the police could observe me in. A metal chair was the only furniture in the middle of this thing, bolted to the concrete floor. And attached to this metal chair were chains, ankle chains and wrist chains, and that was it, by the way, of furniture. And I was kept in that room for 2 months. Before being moved into the broader prison. So probably the worst time of all was that very first 2 months where I was kept in complete isolation in the box. I did have one call in the middle of it with the Australian Embassy and then to my wife and so on. But other than that, the whole 2 months then was just spent on my own, and the only visitors were the interrogators.
how often would they come in and interrogate you?
Random, completely random, which I think was part of the tactic. So some days they wouldn't come at all. Other days they would come twice a day. Other days they would come 3 or 4 times during the day, and sometimes in the middle of the night. 1, 2 in the morning, etc., and wake me up. And I was just lying on the concrete floor anyway, so the conditions were pretty awful. But they would just come in and just start arbitrarily shouting questions, often really stupid questions and insane sort of questions, just to I think put me off and all that. So so that first 2 months was pretty bad. But then being moved into the prison was pretty bad as well because Insane Prison was built in the 19th century and it looks every bit the horrible sort of 19th century prison would look like, iron bars, concrete, filthy concrete cells, all the rest of it, and a very imposing guard house where you enter and just going across the threshold then, and I was handcuffed and had, leg irons on and all the rest of it. It was just a horrifying moment.
So for someone that may not be aware or familiar what it may be like to be in solitary confinement and then have people come in and interrogate you at random times, like how do you cope with that?
Yeah, it's really tough because you're just 100% vulnerable. You're totally at the whim of the interrogators. They treated me better than they did Burmese prisoners, but they still ill treated me. Occasional punches and kicks, and one guy, pretended to set fire to my hair and things like that. Pretty awful. I sort of coped in some ways the worst times are almost waiting for it to happen. And I had a number of strategies to deal with that. I used my mind to try and turn my mind off things. So I, told many people the story of trying to remember all the US presidents in chronological order, reciting that, remembering all the US states, remembering Australian prime ministers in order, and then just simply, pacing up and down the box and counting and things like that. Uh, Things like that sort of get your mind off some of the horrible things around you. But so those were just some of the sort of basic survival strategies.
Did that sort of come naturally to you, or were you sort of prepared somewhat from things that you had learned in your past from watching movies, hearing stories, that sort
Yeah,
of thing?
sure did. In fact, my misspent teenage years being addicted to prisoner of war escape stories, the Great Escape, Golditz, all this sort of stuff helped me immeasurably. And it's funny, my survival strategy was not in any way sort of new ideas about psychology or anything like that. It was sort of old-fashioned notions of, you know, not on my part daring do, but how people had survived in the Second World War, and stories of Weary Dunlop and Changi, and all that sort of stuff. Very much old-fashioned sort of just resilience was what I tried to draw on.
Old-fashioned resilience. That's something I haven't heard on for a while, to
Indeed.
be honest with you. Like
Yeah, no, indeed.
when you hear about the term resilience, what does that actually mean to you?
Ah, well, I think it just means going on, regardless of what's happening around you. The other thing I should mention, was just the idea that I knew that I had incredible support outside, led by my wife, my dad, my sister, my daughter, all the family. I knew they were behind me, and I knew I had to get through for them. So that's part of it as well, knowing the incredible efforts that they were all taking, but all sorts of people in Australia as well. One of the things that came out of it. Many horrible things, but many upsides as well. And one of them, just the basic humanity, generosity of people of Australia. Burmese prisoners who subsequently became part of as well. The general prison population, incredibly supportive. So, all of those things really helpful as well. So, resilience, I think, is partly within you and the stories that you tell yourself. And again, that's where those old stories help, but also it's the assistance of other people. I don't want to suggest that this is a solitary endeavor. It's very much with the help of people, whether they're with you at the time or whether they're thousands of miles away, but just knowing that they're there for you. I think that's a really strong part of it as well.
Yeah. What were your family doing outside? Did you know?
I did, or I got to know when eventually I was allowed to talk to my wife. So yeah, just raising up a ruckus, basically, at every level. Through social media, through the traditional media, but then advocating with politicians, the highest levels of government in Australia, the US, the UK, everywhere. Again, led by my wife, who did extraordinary things. She would agitate. She was born in Vietnam, so she took the campaign to the Vietnamese government, who advocated on my behalf. The Americans all interceded. My wife wrote letters to the dictator of Myanmar and his wife, the dictator's wife, and basically appealed to her just to say, look, if this was your husband, you'd be doing all that you could from one wife to another. Please release my husband, things like that. But then, yeah, all sorts of friends rallied to the cause. The people at Macquarie Uni and all the universities actually in Australia wrote petitions. There were people petitioning the Parliament. Yeah, just a huge groundswell of support, which, for the rest of my days, I will be forever grateful to.
Did any of the politicians listen?
They did, yeah, and the Australian government was good. I know in other cases there've been failures and so on. In my case, that they were pretty good, and really just there. And then in other ways as well, apart from listening, just in terms of trying to get me released, then in getting stuff to me. So my wife cooked a lot of food, like bakery products, which Australia then assisted in getting them to me through the diplomatic pouch from Canberra to Rangoon, and then to me in the prison. So yeah, so the Australian government again, particularly in support, were great as well. But I must mention too the US government, the UK government, and in particular Prince Charles and then King Charles, were incredibly supportive too. So I had a lot of very powerful people at my back.
Yeah, especially King Charles. I mean, did he write a letter to the dictator?
He sure did, and he wrote letters to my wife, and he was just incredibly supportive. And then one of the great pleasures that we had since my release was to go and see him at Windsor Castle just a week or so before the coronation, and he was wonderful. He was just so incredible, welcoming, and humble. Sounds odd to say, but yeah, and so he was fantastic. But it extended into very senior politicians in the US as well as Australia as well. So yeah, all in all, the political class actually perform well, I think, in this situation.
Sounds like your wife stirred up a hornet's nest. Yeah,
That's right.
sounded.
That's right. She's a very powerful woman, and somebody in Australia's Department of Foreign Affairs told me that however much pushback they got from Myanmar's military junta, the one pushback they really didn't want was from her. So my wife Harvu, and they said, yeah, the thing they never wanted to hear on any particular day throughout all of this was that Ha is not happy. Those are the words they never wanted to hear.
I mean, if you see a photo of your wife, I mean, she looks like one of the most loveliest ladies in on the face of the earth. But the thing is, you don't want to mess with her because
You
she
don't. No,
has a
that's right.
tiger inside of her, especially for those that she loves. I love that.
Absolutely.
So,
Absolutely.
for those people that need to know about what prison life is like, what goes on, sort of the day to day situation.
Yeah, well, it's pretty awful. I mean, it's just mind-numbing boredom is one thing, and in conditions that are just awful, and just always that anxiety that you have constantly because nothing is under your control. So, the fashionable word these days of agency. Well, in this situation, you have no agency at all. So you're always feeling vulnerable, always feeling anxious. The food is terrible. They would deliver food twice a day in a plastic bucket, and it wasn't even a clean bucket or anything. And yeah, so the food's awful. Everything is just awful. The cell was like in this old insane prison that I mentioned earlier, just completely open to the elements. So it was rats and spiders and centipedes and I don't mean friendly little centipedes, but really awful big stinging sort of centipedes. Scorpions and all that were just coming in and out of the cell at will. The cells themselves were, incredibly grimy. The floor was often wet, mildewed walls, and deeply unhealthy places. So yeah, horrible environment, in which you just try and get through. Once I was with other prisoners and other political prisoners, particularly in Myanmar, things were much better because you're able to support each other, and they were incredibly supportive of me. So yeah, so all of that helps. And then finally, when I was able to get deliveries, I mentioned food being delivered to me, but I was also able to get deliveries of books, and that helped a lot because all of my life I've been a voracious reader, and as soon as I got the books, things just improved dramatically because I have a very vivid imagination, and so I'm able to fully immerse into a book and almost, not quite, but almost make the rest of the world disappear.
Yeah, transport yourself out of the world that you're currently in into the world that you're actually reading. I do the exact same
That's
thing.
right.
Like
Yep,
if I
indeed.
get stuck into a book, like there's no distracting me.
Yep, yep,
Yeah, that's my philosophy, at least.
indeed. Yep.
Yeah, nothing like getting lost in a good book, I say. Um,
Exactly, mate. And many of the books, they were just the sort of books to do that. So one of the most notable ones was Lord of the Rings, of course, which everyone will be familiar with. And another real surprise package, mate, was a book called Cultural Amnesia, written by Clive James. I'm sure many listeners and viewers will remember Clive James, a well-known Australian performer, but a great writer, a little bit sort of underestimated, I think, on that front. And he wrote this wonderful book, not too far before he died, which sort of summed up all the lessons of his life and really a story of the 20th century. Yeah, this book called Cultural Amnesia, which was just great. And so I learned a lot from that as well.
I was speaking to Dr. Kylie Moore Gilbert, who
Oh,
was another political prisoner, and her story was just astounding as well. Like the things,
Jay,
yeah.
I must tell you on that, like, yes. And one of the books was Kylie's.
Ah,
And in fact, the whole story was wonderful. On one of the phone calls, so this is about a year in, my wife suddenly said to me, she said, um, I've received a call from Kylie from Melbourne. And of course, in my phone calls with my wife, we always had to speak in code because I was never allowed to, she couldn't tell me things that were going on relating to my case and all sorts of things. And so my wife just said, yeah, that she got a call from Kylie from Melbourne who wanted to offer her support. And at first I didn't know who this was, and I thought, is it Kylie Minogue? And I thought, why would Kylie not be involved in my case? And then I suddenly remembered that, wait a minute, this lady from Melbourne who'd been detained by the Iranians was called Kylie. And anyway, my wife ended up being able to send Kylie's book to me. And even more remarkably, the Myanmar authorities, I guess they didn't know what sort of book it was. It got through to me. And that was an incredibly helpful book as well. And I took a lot of the lessons from Kylie of how she got through. And then also, right to the present, as soon as I got out, I've been in touch with Kylie, and she's an incredible person, actually incredibly supportive of me, as I say, while I was a prisoner, but since I've got back as well, to coping back with life. So yeah, I'm fascinated then, Jay, that you've spoken to her as well, because she's just fantastic person.
I asked her this question and I was actually surprised by her answer about claiming victimhood. And
Oh, okay.
she said that she doesn't have that mindset at all, which I was
Mm-hmm.
quite impressed by, because it's so easy in that
Yep.
moment to claim victimhood
Yep.
and
Yep.
to say, oh, woe is me, like life is
Yep.
doom
Yep.
and gloom and it's oppressive, and just to complain all the time. And I think there's so many young people out there in society that have got it incredibly good and they're still claiming to be victims. But yet you got someone like Kylie, and I'm going to ask you the same question. Like, did you proclaim to be a victim at all once, Sean, or why didn't you?
No, never. So I 100% agree with Kylie on this. And I think the trouble is with being a victim is that it robs you of agency,
Yeah.
right? So it just means, we've mentioned that term again and again. And so whilst you would feel you didn't have agency, you spent the time trying to create it. And I mentioned the books and exercise, pacing, all that sort of stuff, trying to stay on top of things, thinking clearly, etc., and not surrendering. So I think identifying as a victim immediately then puts you at the whim of your captors. So yeah, so I think it's a really important point. For me too, I knew I was part of a bigger struggle. Again, this military regime in Burma or Myanmar is just terrible. They're awful, and it's good to be against them. And I took pride in that. I took pride in the fact that they arrested me, because, in a sense, that meant that they were frightened of me. It might have been that my situation was scary, but I liked the idea that I frightened them. The military regime, by the way, is very upset with me again now, because I've been quite outspoken and all that, and that gives me very great pleasure as well. So I completely agree with Kylie. I think it's important not to see yourself as a victim again, not for any other purpose, but for yourself, because it gives you agency, and that gives you energy, and can allow you to do things.
What do you think about the young people today claiming to be victim and being all oppressed and everything like that?
Well, I think it's a real problem. It's with some real anxiety that I look around the West at the moment, to be honest. I worry terribly, this whole victim culture, cancel culture, and all that, safe spaces, unsafe speech and all that. I mean, it's absurd, quite frankly. Partly I blame my own cohort, to be honest, of academics. I
Really?
think
Yeah.
the whole shift of academia, towards some of this stuff, trigger warnings, all that, to me, profoundly disturbing, and doing immense damage, I think. So, yeah, I do really worry about the whole drift of academia in this sort of way of encouraging, I think, people to think themselves as victims. Issues of identity politics and all the rest of it. Again, I'm so worried about it, because I have a very simple notion that we're all human beings with inalienable rights, regardless of our background and all the rest of it. And it worries me terribly, actually, that the direction, again, that higher education has taken, but other broad areas of society as well. So yeah, so I think that there's plenty of blame to go around on that front. So, to that extent, I feel a little bit sorry for the younger generation, actually, and what they've been dished up.
I do too. And I honestly wish I had you as my lecturer or my professor when I was at Macquarie Uni, Sean, because the lecturers that I got, honestly, I don't mean to speak bad about the Macquarie staff, but I went
Yeah.
to a critical thinking lecture, and it
Right.
wasn't really teaching me how to think. It was teaching me what
No.
to think.
Right.
And I saw a great problem with that, because you had one person that was really outspoken about a certain thing, about a
Yeah.
certain subject matter, and you had the vast majority of people who would just pile on
Yeah.
against the poor person. I'd just be like, hang on a minute, stop for a second, take a deep step back, let's breathe, let's allow that person their right to freedom of speech too, and not just pile onto them because that person is actually a critical thinker and you guys are just following along with everything the lecturer is actually saying. It's not right in my opinion.
No, it's not right. And of course it recalls that scene in Monty Python, right? The Life of Brian, where, he declares to them that they're all individuals and they all recite back, yes, we're all individuals, until there's a lone voice that says, I'm not. And so thus identifying who exactly was the individual. So yeah.
I miss the
No, it's
old days, to be honest with you, Sean. Even
indeed,
though even
indeed.
though I'm young and I know that I'm
Exactly.
young,
Yeah.
I
Yep.
really do miss the old times. I mean, I was listening to a podcast with Believers comedian John Cleese and John Anderson. And John
Yep.
Cleese, he goes, all the wokies running around thinking that they can talk everybody down and say that they're right and you're wrong. He goes, it's nonsense. And he goes, you're in trouble when they're going after the comedians, and
Right.
it's like comedy's no longer funny anymore to them.
Right.
And it's like they're claiming they got to shut you down. And it's sad to see what's happening with our very own government too. Like they're shutting down freedom of speech.
Mhm.
And I'm very much like you. I'm worried, and I'm also fearful for the next generation of young people that are allowing this to happen.
Yep.
Because we should be in a democratic Western country. We shouldn't be like Myanmar or any of those other countries that suppress all of that stuff and don't allow you to express your right to say things. We may not like what you have to say. It doesn't mean you're not allowed to say it, so to speak.
I totally agree, Jane. Again, my experience is experiencing where that can go, the extremities of that. And the whole experience, I guess, underlines for me the importance of freedom of speech and freedom more broadly. I'm more committed than ever before to the notion of freedom. I just the basic default right that we have, I think, is to be free. And then there are other rights that come after that, but that's the foundational one.
Yeah, amen to that, my friend. So I wanted to ask you about how you were able to find a sense of, I mean, we've spoken about how you're able to get sort of a more resilient mind, but you're in there for 650 days. Did you know if you're ever going to get out?
Um, I always thought that I would at some point, but that day kept on disappearing into the distance, of course. So I began to worry, and I think on that front, the worst time was just after I was sentenced, which is about a year and a half in. There that would have been a logical place for me to be expelled at that point as well, which is the long history of Myanmar was that people were often given sentences and then expelled from the country. So at that moment, a year and a half in, given a sentence that would have kept me there for another 3 years after that, I started to worry at that point that I was going to be there for the full 3 years after that. So yeah, so I was quite worried about that. Yeah, so I think that was the worst time at thinking that I was going to be there for a really long time.
And were you ever put on death row at all?
Yeah, I was. Yeah. So right after the sentencing, I was then put in solitary confinement back in insane prison down in Yangon. And I was put in an area which physically was a better area, it was sort of like these individual cells in the middle of a sort of tree area. So the physical environment was a little bit better, but it was very isolating because it was in yeah, it was solitary confinement. But I noticed when I was there, I suddenly realized where I was, that it was death row, where so the physical environment was a little bit better, but it was solitary confinement and it was death row. And I only noticed it because I suddenly saw that the other prisoners in these little isolated cells were wearing orange outfits, and the standard prison outfit was blue. And I thought, wow, why are these prisoners wearing orange? And then it suddenly occurred to me, and I remembered that that's the color of death row. And so that was pretty horrible because for the last 2 months I was there, I was in this place amongst people who were condemned in that way. Who I might add, though, were extraordinarily generous and again nice to me. So here we've got people with less than nothing, with a death sentence on them, and when they saw me and they knew who I was, they would send me their bread ration. So they used to get a special bread ration because they were on death row, and they sent it to me on the basis they thought, oh, well, look, here's Sean, this poor Australian guy. Maybe he's getting sick of rice. Let's send him some bread. I mean, I remember at the time, and I'm amazed at it still. I mean, how do you begin to thank or appreciate people who, again, of such extraordinary generosity? So I guess the only good thing about that was when I finally was released, I was hopefully, I think some of the books and other things that I had in my cell went to them. I'm somewhat hopeful anyway, but yeah, just extraordinary.
So that probably would have become a really stark reality. I mean, you're in prison, but then being transferred to death row of all things.
That
Like
that's right.
not
Yeah, yeah,
knowing. Yeah.
yeah. Pretty horrible moment. It was made more horrible because um, a death sentence was something Myanmar has had in place for a long time, but for about 50 years it had never been acted upon. But then, about 2 months before I arrived in this area of death row, they had started executing prisoners again. So it really added to the sort of stress and anxiety of being in that place.
It's unreal. Really is that this actually happened to you. I
Mm.
guess, how did you get out? Like,
Yeah, well, very unexpectedly. So finally, what I'd always been waiting upon, which was some sort of amnesty from Myanmar's regime, because, and I should just add here, traditionally, again, it's what they did with high-profile foreigners. What they tended to do was keep them, charge them, sentence them, and then deport them. They kept me a bit longer than that, but finally an amnesty arrived in November 2022. But very unexpectedly, my wife and I had sort of begun to give up hope. And in fact, the day before I was released, it was one of our phone call days, and we both agreed that I would not be released before Christmas that year, and that I would, I was still going to be there for many more months. But yeah, so totally unexpectedly, on the 17th of November 2022, prison guard suddenly appeared in my cell and said, Sean, good news, you're going home. And I remember just being totally dumbstruck. I really didn't know what to do. The only reaction I had to him was to say, look, please tell me you're not kidding. And he said, no, I'm not. But you've only got 10 minutes. You've got to pack up your stuff and go. And I remember just, yeah, again, just being completely at a loss as to what to do. I didn't know, should I pack? Should I not? Should I just leave everything? And then I remembered that my wife said, please don't bring any clothes or anything like that home. So I ended up leaving just about everything there. And then, yeah, as I say, 10 minutes later, I'm being escorted out of the prison to great cheers and so on of the other political prisoners, and which was a great moment. But I remained anxious actually all the way through until I got on a plane back to Australia because Myanmar's military also have another tradition, but mostly the local prisoners, where they sometimes give them extra charges just as they're taking them out the door. They often put other charges on them, put them back into the prison. So I was terrified all the way, as I say, until that plane left the tarmac. I was still pretty anxious, to be honest.
who was responsible for making it happen that you got released?
Well, I think the international community more broadly, if it wasn't for that pressure, I don't think the military regime in Myanmar would have released me. And the proof of that is just simply what they've done to the locals. So people like Aung San Suu Kyi, many of the people I work with in that civilian government, they all remain in the prison. So I think that's the proof of what wouldn't have happened in the absence of international advocacy. So yeah, so it's really the campaigns in Australia and around the world that got me released.
And then what was it like for you to step foot on home soil again?
Just wonderful. I mean, it was so good. I mean, I'm a Sydney sider, but one of the odd things was that there was, and again, because COVID had just ended, and so the planes were absolutely chock a block, and so the Department of Foreign Affairs, the only flight they could get me back to Australia quickly, and they wanted to get me back quickly, which was good, but the only flight they could get me back on was one that went from Yangon to Bangkok and Bangkok to Melbourne. So my initial arrival in Sydney was Melbourne, most disconcerting. But then, no,
I love
anyway,
that.
I shouldn't play with my all my Melbourne friends. Um, but it was a great homecoming in Melbourne because my wife had flown down that morning from Sydney to Melbourne, so she was there to greet me. And then, in a wonderful gesture, the Prime Minister left his plane available to take me back up to Sydney. So the very last leg of the journey was on the Prime Minister's the small jet that the Prime Minister uses, which apparently they call the Shark. And so on that jet, we were taken back to Sydney, and it was just just extraordinary. So, and then arriving back in Sydney, it was a beautiful day, and the sun was there, and yeah, my dad, my daughter, my sister, nephews, everyone was there to greet me, and it was just fantastic. It was one of those really wonderful Australia days that has no replication anywhere around the world. The intense blue skies, for instance, it's one of the first things you know. You think, oh wow, this is a paradise.
Was this when Albo was Prime Minister or was Scott Morrison?
Yeah, no. So Albo was prime minister by then. He wasn't there to greet me because he was at a ASEAN +2 or whatever those meetings are with Asian leaders in Bangkok. So I actually spoke to him in Bangkok whilst in transit, and we had a wonderful conversation. Actually, and he was extremely moved, and then was moved again when he told the story to the Australian press. So yeah, great conversation with him. Wonderful conversation with Penny Wong as well. And just to keep it bipartisan, great conversations later on with people like Simon Birmingham, the coalition spokesman for foreign affairs, and with Peter Dutton and other people as well. So again, I think as an entire political class in Australia, the differences just vanished, and we're all Australians. Yeah, so it was just good all around.
I think politics aside, you just got to realize the humanity.
Yeah,
I think.
yeah, I think so, mate. And the values that unite us, which sounds trite sometimes, but in situations like mine, it actually becomes real. It's not just an empty statement. There are really deep values, and they're on display every
Yeah,
now and then.
some people nowadays they tend to forget that, which I think is really sad. They tend to focus more on the one-sidedness or the
Right.
person's politics, and that oftentimes dictates their decision on doing things, which is just absolutely ludicrous if you ask me. Like,
Yeah.
just grow up, have a conversation with the person. They are a human being after all.
Yeah.
That's what counts at the end of the day.
Absolutely.
That's what you should look
Yeah.
at and focus on. Like, just, yeah, that's the way I think it should be in today's world. But alas, can't have everything, can we, Sean?
No, indeed, mate. I'm 100% agreement, but also in agreement that unfortunately we don't have it. But yeah, it'll be certainly something to wish for.
And then you decided to write a book. Not
That's
long.
right. So
Yeah.
yep. So part of the whole story was to write a book. I knew I always would. In fact, I told my fellow political prisoners that I would. And I said one of the really important things I had to get from them was permission to use their names. And I said, look, I'm going to write a book. It's one of the first things I'm going to do. I'd like to use your names, but I know that could place you in danger. So feel free to tell me not to. And all of them wanted their names in. So which was fine. And then to sort of lighten the mood, when I asked them this, I said, look, and the other question you have to answer is, who do you want to play you in the movie? So, which and of course that they all claimed fairly ludicrous actors to play them. And I said to them, look, I'll agree to anything as long as you allow Brad Pitt to play me in the movie, then you can have anyone. Um, so yeah, so and then the book was good to write. quite quick. As an academic, I'm used to writing things, but as an academic, writing is always a slow process. Of footnoting and
Yeah.
evidence shifting and all that sort of stuff. But when you write from your head and from your heart and from your experiences, it's a much quicker process. And so I really enjoyed it a lot.
So who do you want to play you in your movie?
Well, I'll still go for Brad Pitt, but as I said in the book, and as I said to the other political prisoners, I really worried that they might cast Danny DeVito. So,
He's not so bad. I love Danny.
well, he's not bad, that's true, but I'd rather Brad Pitt.
Yeah, Brad Pitt's a lot better.
Yeah,
Hopefully Danny's not listening to this and going, Jared, come on,
indeed,
Jay, what are you doing?
indeed.
But Sean, you seem like a very down to earth, humble person, which I really do appreciate. And it's like, as the title of your book indicates, a very unlikely prisoner. Would not expect you, of all people, to be held in a jail of all things. It seems like the very last place to be housing you. I mean, but I'm enormously grateful for you and being able to share your story with my audience today. Where do you want people to get a copy of your book?
Well, in any good bookstore, as they as they famously say, right? So the physical book will be available all through Australia in the bookstores from November 14. You can get a Kindle version and an audio version as well, and the audio version, in fact, is read by me. And my wife does her own voice to her own letters in the book as well. So so there's an audio one, but certainly in all the local bookstores, it should be available.
My final question for you, Sean, is what do you love the most about yourself and your story?
Oh, that's an interesting one. Probably that word resilience, which is overused. No, you know what? No, scratch that one. I think optimism
Mm.
above all. I think that's better because all along I really, I mean, again, it sounds sort of trite, but I really did try and look on the bright side of things, and I visualized and imagined life back in Australia and how good that would be. I would say that just keeping a focus on that things will get better. Optimism.
I love that answer. Sean, thank you so much for your time, your wisdom, your advice, and your story, and for joining me today on the Storybox podcast.
Thank you very much, Jay. It's been a real pleasure, mate.